When watching older movies, sometimes it can be really helpful to understand the historical context of those movies. So today I want to talk about one of my favorite old pictures, Casablanca. Casablanca is a 1942 Warner Brothers picture directed by the great Michael Curtiz. Throughout the 1930s, Hitler and the Nazis were on the rise. By the end of the 30s, had begun invading and occupying other countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia. In Hollywood, very few studios were willing to speak out against Hitler and the Nazis in any of their films. Certain actors and filmmakers were very vocally anti-Nazi, including Edward G. Robinson, who starred in a film in 1939 called Confessions of a Nazi Spy at Warner Brothers. There were heavy protests. The Production Code Administration that enforced Hollywood's self-censorship tried to keep the movie from being made for a while. There were reports of sabotage on the set. The movie was, of course, banned in Germany. Hitler subsequently banned all Warner Brothers projects. This, of course, prompted other studio heads to not make any films critical of Hitler or the Nazis for fear that they would lose the big German market. So nobody was really making anti-Nazi films or anything like that. Throughout America, there was a pervasive desire for isolationism. It didn't matter that our allies were being attacked and invaded and occupied. We had already been through one world war. Let Europe deal with their own issues. Let Asia deal with its own issues. Hitler's not our problem. Fascism isn't our problem. Let's just keep our heads in the sand. Then, of course, in December of 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, and suddenly America is in the war. Charlie Chaplin had been heavily criticized for making The Great Dictator in 1940. Now, after Pearl Harbor, everybody was making movies that were anti-Nazi and anti-fascist. Warner Brothers, to take advantage of the fervor over the Allied invasion of Northern Africa, decided to rush Casablanca into production. It wasn't really seen as anything that was going to stand out, despite the fact that it had a number of really extraordinary talents working on it. The film, of course, starred Humphrey Bogart, who had become a major star the year before with The Maltese Falcon. Ingrid Bergman plays the character of Ilsa, would go on to lots of other excellent films like Hitchcock's Notorious. There's also a who's who of wonderful supporting actors in this film. Claude Rains, one of my favorite actors from that era, plays the chief of police, Louis Renault. We also have the wonderful Dooley Wilson playing Sam, one of the most sympathetic black characters to come out of Hollywood at that time. Peter Lorre shows up for a small role in the film, one of the most parodied actors of his time, but did a lot of great horror and thriller films. The main villain in the film is played by Conrad Veidt, a German actor that had previously appeared in notable silent films like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and The Man Who Laughs. His character in that film actually was one of the main inspirations for the Joker in the Batman comic books. Casablanca takes place in Casablanca in French Morocco in 1941, just before the attack on Pearl Harbor, and this is an important part of it. Casablanca itself is part of Vichy France, which is essentially an independent French state, separate from the part of France that's occupied by the Nazis. But that doesn't mean that there's not a Nazi presence in Vichy. So Casablanca becomes this refugee city for people from all over Europe who are trying to escape from Hitler and Mussolini. Rick's Cafe is a microcosm of that concept, where we see people from a lot of different nationalities and ethnicities all gathering together for a good time, or to kill time until they can escape, or to try to find a way to escape. Into this cafe comes this Czechoslovakian freedom fighter played by Paul Heinrich named Victor Laszlo. Laszlo writes anti-Nazi propaganda. Rick's Cafe is owned by Rick, Humphrey Bogart's character. Rick is an American expatriate hiding out in Casablanca. We never know exactly why, but we do know that he has been involved in fights against tyranny and fascism and so on in previous days. But now he's isolated himself in this cafe. Rick himself becomes a metaphor for American isolationism. He doesn't want anything to do with the fight. In the context of the story, his motivation for that is he was hurt romantically. Ilsa stood him up on the day that they were going to leave Paris to escape from the Nazis, and now he wants nothing to do with the fight. It's not his problem. Much like the way Americans viewed World War II prior to Pearl Harbor. Throughout the course of Casablanca's story, Rick gets pulled in to the events that are going on and what's happening with Victor Laszlo and running into his ex-lover Ilsa, and ultimately in the end of the film, Rick chooses to rejoin the fight against the Nazis, and he gives up his romance with Ilsa because he learns that real love should not be a selfish thing. Real love needs to be about what's best for the other person, but it's also because Rick has regained his ideals. We have to fight against fascism. We can't just stick our heads in the sand and pretend it'll all go away, or pretend it doesn't affect me, because it does affect me. So Casablanca's plot is really intrinsically connected to what was going on in the world at that time. The film went on to become a massive success. It ended up winning the Oscar for Best Picture, and it's become this very iconic cultural touchstone with lines of dialogue that you probably know even if you haven't seen the film. I hope this has given you a little bit more of a sense of Casablanca's place in history. Here's looking at you, kid.